Hello, welcome to the virtual booth of the Association of Book Publishers of BC. This author event features Jeanette and Lauren Manning, who will be talking about their forthcoming book, Walking Away from Hate, Our Journey Through Extremism.
I didn't set out to raise a skinhead. It just happened. Okay, it didn't just happen. Like most parents, my husband and I had the best of intentions, planning to instill good manners, respect, decency, and kindness into both of our children. I thought we'd done a fairly good job. But when your last thought before going to sleep is, will my daughter commit an act of violence against another human being, you know you've missed something along the way. Good afternoon. I'm Jeanette Manning, and this is my daughter, Lauren.
Good afternoon, everyone. I always felt out of place in my youth. I was never comfortable in my own skin, wearing baggy guys' clothes while questioning my sexual identity in my early teens. Being the first grandchild on my mom's side of the family, I was made to feel special as long as I did what my papa wanted. When I started having my own opinions, he withdrew his love, making me feel as though I disappointed him. I was 16 when my dad passed away after a 9-year battle with cancer. He was my best friend, and after his death, I was left with this huge void. My family seemed to think that a switch had flipped in me after seeing his lifeless body in a hospital bed. Now, that's probably true, but the seeds were planted well before this. I took to binge drinking a few months after his passing, but eventually that wasn't enough. I was quiet in school, but as soon as I left that building, I never failed to find trouble of some kind. I liked the instant gratification this gave me, even if it did come with consequences. I was opposed to the mainstream, feeling like I had no place there, so the heavy metal music scene's energy and aggression really resonated with me at this time. In early November 2007, I was on Nocturnal Mortem's Facebook page when I received a message from a guy named Donnie. It said, I was wondering if you're NS or just listen to NSBM. I didn't know what he meant, figuring NS and NSBM were just music genres. I responded, I'm not NS, I just listen to the music. I had a hard time understanding a lot of the NSBM lyrics, mostly because the recording quality was terrible, but not wanting to sound stupid, I didn't ask what NS meant. I just enjoyed having someone to chat with. A few days later, Donnie messaged me that his friend in Ottawa had been beaten up by a couple black guys. He said, and I quote, "This is how us white people get treated, and blacks get away with this shit." I wasn't exactly sure what Donnie meant, but it sounded a lot like what Papa used to say. It was familiar, which made me think that it must be true. We continued messaging every few days, and 2 weeks after our first conversation, Donnie suggested that we meet up. I wanted to get to know him a bit better first, so I said I'd call him instead. First time we spoke on the phone, he seemed more interested in yelling at his neighbor, which made me laugh, especially with his Scottish accent. During our third conversation, he told me, Jewish people are very elitist. If you think the people at your high school are preps, you should meet some Jews. They're exclusive, a real chore to be around. They look down their noses at you. I'd never known anyone who was of Jewish descent, but I reasoned that he probably knew more than I did. After all, he was 26 and lived in the city. For the next couple weeks, I dated Connor, listened to metal and NSBM, downloaded more bands like Nocturnal Mortem, and talked to Donnie, who said nothing more about whites, Jews, or blacks. I liked the way he spoke to me, as though he'd known me forever. He told me, "You're smarter than everyone else around you. There needs to be more girls in the world like you." He made me feel like I mattered. Sometime around the beginning of December, Donnie finally labeled his way of thinking as National Socialism and began referring to it as the movement. He explained that Jews controlled the world and that Blacks were trying to get back at white people for enslaving them. History books were trying to instill a sense of shame and guilt in white kids just for being white. He was part of a resistance movement fighting to ensure that the white population survived. Whenever we talked, Donnie would use whatever I said and led the conversation into his own narrative about the victimization of the white race. I began thinking I was learning more from him than I had from any of the teachers at my school.
After my husband's death, we were all grieving, but Lauren's grief took the form of anger. For months, there were slamming doors, there were arguments, and her brother took to hiding in his room whenever we started yelling at each other. About 9 months after his passing, I started to realize that it was more than just grief. She was picking fights constantly with her brother and myself. She was throwing things at the walls, slamming doors. I didn't have any idea what was behind it, but apparently as her self-radicalization grew, we had more arguments. I was trying hard to be a mother and father while I was grieving my husband's passing. I was working long hours, trying to keep the roof over our heads and trying to keep our household in one piece, but I still couldn't figure out where I'd gone wrong. Things finally came to a head about 3 weeks after Lauren's 18th birthday. Her racist slurs and her rants were just unbearable, and her relationships with her brother and I were disintegrating, and I felt I had no choice but to give her an ultimatum. Your friends or your family. But I never in a million years thought she would choose her friends. As I struggled with the guilt and the shame, I had really only my mom, my son, and my best friend who lived 3 provinces away for support. I didn't want to tell anyone what we were going through. But hours after Lauren left the house, I reached out to her in an email. I was pleading for her to change, for her to come home. Her reply to me was so filled with rage and white power rhetoric that it just blew my mind. And at that point, I knew the daughter we'd raised with love had found an outlet for her anger in hate. So I found myself caught in a tug of war with the movement that I didn't know anything about. I was unaware that she had been lured into white supremacy by Donnie's promises of brotherhood. But I was ashamed. I knew I'd failed Lauren, I'd failed my son and my husband's memory. And I tried really hard to maintain a normal life for my son and told people that Lauren was simply living with friends in Toronto. I was really too embarrassed to admit what she was into. I was naive too and didn't really understand what she was into. And I didn't really want to know. But it was my brother-in-law who said to me one night, "Keep the door open. She'll come back." I clung to that mantra, even after discovering that my credit card and some ID was missing from my purse one morning. There were no signs of forced entry, nor was anything else taken. Cold fear lodged inside me, right before white-hot anger took its place. I immediately knew that Donnie and possibly Lauren had been involved. I wondered how much of it had been her idea. I called the police, anger fueling my decision to blow the whistle on them. There was no way I was going to sit back and play the victim. It was bad enough that they'd stolen my identity, but breaking into my home, my sanctuary, was just too much. The officer I spoke with initially didn't believe me when I said I knew who'd been responsible, which increased my frustration. So I requested Detective Paisley, who thankfully believed me. After promising to forward whatever information I could obtain, I called the Bank of Montreal, who held the MasterCard. They supplied me with details of where and when my charge card had been used. Once I'd given the detective everything, he contacted each of the stores, one of which immediately offered him access to their cameras. Within 2 days, he had the proof he needed. I'm sure he expected me to relent, but my determination never wavered. "That's my daughter," I told the detective through clenched teeth as we sat in a tiny airless interview room, viewing the grainy surveillance footage of my daughter fraudulently purchasing thousands of dollars worth of electronics in my name. Watching Lauren hand over my credit card, her accomplice lurking at the bottom of the screen, I added angrily, "And that is Donnie." "Do you want to press charges, Mrs. Manning?" I'd hit rock bottom. Yes. Lauren would have to deal with 2 charges of possession, use of a credit card, 1 count of fraud under $5,000, 1 count of impersonation with intent, 1 charge of forgery, and 1 count of possession of property under $5,000. Due to staffing constraints and distance, he warned me that it would take some time to process everything, to locate and serve Lauren and Donnie, and try them in an Oshawa courthouse. That's fine, I thought. I'll wait.
I found each group came with some seriously unmet expectations. The SD crew, the first one I was in, were out to prove themselves to the rest of society and make our presence known, but their inner fighting ultimately caused the group to collapse, and that is totally not uncommon within other white power groups as well. Blood and Honor claimed their mission was to ignite some kind of race war. However, they were consumed by illegal substances and eventually jumped me thinking that I had ratted them out for some of their criminal activities. The Hammerskins appeared better organized and promoted hate music, but in the end, it seemed as though they were more interested in promoting this traditional women's roles, which really did not work for me. My partner at the time, he couldn't separate his group ideals from his personal life with me, so eventually we split up. The start of my disengagement came in 2012 after another member was murdered, stabbed to death. So this guy, Jan, he was a close friend of mine, and I remember this news like it was yesterday. When some of the others had spread rumors claiming he'd been attacked because of his affiliation with white power, this is where I began questioning this victim complex of ours. Who was really making our lives miserable, them or us? I began seeing many parallels between each character I had met and each group I came across while in this movement. I eventually realized that I was in this very stagnant place and nothing in my own life would improve as long as I stayed here. I did not want to have kids. I didn't think it was right to raise them in hate, but that was what the movement and my boyfriend wanted me to do. Additionally, I didn't want to be subservient, something women were expected to be. I was tired of pretending to be someone I'm not. I found a post entitled "Wanting or Thinking of Leaving the Movement." Read this, please. It was a note Jan's mother had posted on the internet for the world to see. It read, Jan was another angry young man that as a teenager on an unfortunate trip to Germany was recruited into whatever white power skinhead group happened to be near his father's house. He had gone to connect with his birth father, and as that had gone very badly, he was prey for a group looking for angry, blonde, and blue-eyed members. Jan fit that bill perfectly, and at the time, and that was the first time I lost my son. Now, I've lost him forever. The recruitment and brainwashing still happens all over the world, like it does with any other cult, and the recruits are still all looking for whatever it is in individual cases. Other angry young men will be replacing my son, and other mothers will be heartbroken. Jan was also an adored big brother, a loved and loving son, grandson, cousin, nephew, and friend to those of us who actually knew him. I didn't want to show my mom this note at first, not because I worried about criticism or I told you so's, because I realized that she'd fear writing the same thing many times in the past about me. No parent should ever outlive their kid, I thought as I stared at the computer screen, especially under these circumstances. I understood, even through my extremist and often drunk lens, how much it had taken for Jan's mother to write this article, how painful and difficult it must have been. Sitting there, something had triggered in my memory, an email from my mom that she had written back when I was on the streets and out of contact with my family. I know the daughter I love is still in there somewhere. I could imagine my mom writing something similar to what Jan's mother had written, and it sent me reeling. Yet another shock to my already battered system.
After just a little over 2 years on the streets, Lauren finally moved home really only because she ran out of money. She turned herself into the police the night she came home, and she ended up, after a night in jail, criminal record and a court order. Now, I joke that the court order is a parent's best friend, but honestly, it was a godsend for us. It allowed us to sit down and hammer out rules that we could all live with. It wasn't easy. Lauren was physically back home with her family, but she was still very much active in the movement at that point. In hindsight, I know it was wrong that I insisted she not discuss her white power rhetoric with me. I didn't want to hear any of that in our house, but at that time I was just so relieved to have her back that I didn't want to know anything about it. My assumption was she's home, she's out of their clutches, eventually she'll see how wrong it was. It took several years to really build her trust again, to make her believe she was a part of our family just as much as my son and myself are. It was only after she left the movement for good that we really finally began to talk. And I started to listen. For the first time in a long time, I actually started to listen. Somewhat like childbirth, the years Lauren was involved in extremism are a blur of pain that seems increasingly remote. I truly believe we were lucky. While nightmarish at the time, her choices seem marginal now in comparison to the fates that often befall other lost youth. I think of her crews as people looking for acceptance, friendship, that sense of community that we all want, not as hardened criminals, violent skinheads, or neo-Nazis looking to annihilate another race. While they may have preached those ideals, few, I believe, actually practiced them. The strength of Lauren's will, so often the source of conflict, along with her intelligence and decency, helped her to survive and eventually become the person she was always meant to be. Confident, loving, funny. Part of our family, but also a part of a growing group of people dedicated to helping others escape from extremism. I guess we'll answer some questions.
Yes, no one has at the moment entered any questions into the chat, but if anybody would like to ask some questions rather than doing it, I can unmute everybody and you would be welcome to ask any questions. If not, we have a little bit more of the presentation that we could offer you. If anybody would like to, we have quite a few people attending. So I'll just unmute everybody here. Oh, I have someone who's just joined us. Right. So would you like to tell us a bit about these photos?
Sure. So this is basically the process of tattoo cover-up. I have about 30 hours, give or take, of cover-up time alone. And I also had 1488 that was on the side of my neck laser removed, which, might I add, is extremely painful. I'd rather forget that. So this cover up here, what I basically had my artist do was hide the original symbol underneath where the leaves touch the skull, like at the very top right of the design. So originally, this particular tattoo, the old one, it was one of those ones that I got to prove my commitment. However, I also got it when I joined up with the Hammerskins, just so I could prove, like, hey, I'm still here, I'm still committed. Like, basically, I'm here for life. And honestly, like any other white power tattoo, it generally just holds a really bad connotation, regardless of quality or what it is, etc. So the new piece, that is in memory of my friends Jan and Tim, who are both crossed over, but very much still part of this journey. And since this tattoo is also on the book cover, technically they get to share our book cover too.
I don't know if anybody can see it. There it is there.
Right. Well, there's a question here. What is the significance of that skull tattoo on your leg?
Oh, so, okay, it's a candy skull. Mexican culture, they have the Day of the Dead. So it's basically to celebrate all your dead loved ones. So they paint up skulls that remind them of long lost relatives of theirs. And it's basically just to keep their memory alive. So I've always liked this idea, because as much as grief is very hard to deal with, you also need to like have some positive memories with that person too to hang on to. So I felt this was entirely appropriate for them.
Right. We have another question for you, Lauren. What advice would you give to families hoping to reach young people involved in hate culture? And this is probably a good question for Jeanette as well, for both of you.
You want to start?
Yeah, I'll go first. Well, as my mom's mentioned many times, keep the door open. I always say open dialogue, so pretty much the opposite of what we did when I was there, where we just didn't discuss it at all. Hey, no one's perfect, right?
Yeah, definitely asking questions of your kids when you get the opportunity, showing that you love them, because you can't counter hate with arguments and hate. You can only counter it with love.
Right. Thank you. We have another question. Is there something about Canadian society itself in general that helps white supremacy and extremism make sense to people? So is there something that should be changing besides a person's personal education or healing?
You know what? That's honestly very hard to say, because like of the many exit clients that I do have, I find each of them got in for a different reason. So it's one of those things where it's an individual pathway in and also an individual pathway out.
Right.
If I may say, from a parent's point of view, and I don't know if this is strictly a Canadian thing, if this is a worldwide thing, but parents don't talk about their kids' bad sides. They don't talk about what their kids do wrong to each other on the playground. They only talk about the good things, you know, the A's that they got on tests and so on. As a society, I think Canadians are polite and quiet. But we need to be a little more outspoken. We need to start sharing the information we find out about these organizations. We need to start talking about it more. I think it's important to educate parents and kids, say at a grade 7 level, grade 8 level, so that children understand if you've got issues, if someone's bullying you, if you're not happy at home, you need to speak to somebody. Don't start searching the internet for someone to save you. It's not a safe place.
Yeah, and if I may add something too, I feel like it's so easy to look at the States right now as like the center point for white supremacy, which I'm not going to deny they are. However, like from any of the research that I've read about or even participated in, Canada actually has one of the largest online extremist presences.
Right. This is another question. Having watched the recent storming of the US Capitol, how do you feel about that, given that you were probably in similar positions in your past?
You know what? I have to admit, in recent years, I do consider myself anti-racist. And let's just say the anti-racist in me came out quite often while I was seeing that on the news. What I was actually thinking was, if those were Black Lives Matter protesters, like what would their fate be? Certainly not taking selfies with the authorities there.
Yes, I think you're absolutely right on that. One quick question: you mentioned when we were talking earlier about having the process of covering up the tattoos, but you had one tattoo removed, which was the one on your neck. Could you tell us what the one on your neck, the symbolism of the one on your neck, and what it stood for?
Sure. So it read 1488 in Old English font. So the 14 signifies the 14 words coined by David Lane. It goes, "We must secure the existence of our people and a future for white children." Now, something actually a lot of people don't know is there's another variation of that 14 words. It's something to the effect of, "Because the beauty of the white Aryan woman must not perish from the earth." And the 88 translates to HH Heil Hitler.
Right. Thank you. So, are there any more questions? we have one here. We've got a thank you. So thank you for being so open about this very difficult topic. Makes me feel better than that people can change. And I agree that white supremacy is definitely in Canada as well. Yes, well, it certainly is. We have another question. Lauren, do you fear any backlash now? And could you tell us just for the people who joined late a bit about what happened to you when you did get some backlash before from the organizations you were involved in?
So I did have people send me death threats before. I've been called and yelled at, referred to as a traitor, and I'm not going to start playing victim here. I yelled right back because unfortunately I still had the same attitude for a couple of years after leaving this underground. It's just that now it was being directed elsewhere other than at people of color. Backlash in recent years, honestly, all I've had to worry about, and this happens a lot less than you guys would think, is receiving messages on social media that are half coherent anyways. So most of the time I end up disregarding and deleting them altogether.
Do you and the other outreach workers with Life After Hate, do you experience any sort of personal, physical threats to yourselves when you're involved with dealing with people?
I haven't yet, thankfully. Hopefully it stays that way.
Great, thank you. Right. Well, we just have some more of the tattoos. Do you want to just talk to Lauren about this tattoo that's on your back that's been covered up as well?
Okay, so just so everyone's aware, I know that the picture of the cover up is half finished there. It is fully finished and I have better pictures of it, just putting that out there. So the original tattoo saying Rahowa, it stands for Racial Holy War. And whenever you hear talk of race wars, et cetera, that's basically these groups' objectives for the most part. They believe that tensions will rise enough and all races will take their own side and basically go to war with each other. If anybody knows of the book, The Turner Diaries, I'm not saying go pick it up, but this is where it came from. So, and actually this was my very last cover up that I had to do. The reason why I put it off, honestly, is because the back is one of the more painful spots to get done. And I remember almost passing out after my first appointment.
Right.
It didn't matter that I told her it should be smaller, but.
Well, I also didn't want to pay this one
difference.
with laser treatment first before getting it covered. And I know that my artist Bill had quite a bit of fun with this one.
Right. We have another positive comment here. I'm truly happy for your reformation. I strongly believe that everyone deserves a second chance. And I think you're showing that by the work that you're doing as an outreach worker, trying to help other people get through extremism and come out the other side.
Well, thank you.
Right. Well, I think that brings us to the end of this presentation. Thank you, everybody who joined us. I do hope that you will read the book when it comes out. It's coming out in May, and it's really a very powerful read. One last question here. When you first engaged with Donnie, did you ever question his ideals? What made his arguments so convincing?
I want to say it was more or less the way he presented himself. This is, I have kind of a funny way of describing him. He was basically a circus monkey that you just kept around for your entertainment. And at the time as a 17-year-old, I thought that was hilarious. So as far as his arguments that he was presenting, for me, I come from a very whitewashed town, so it's easy to buy those things if you have never really had much interaction with people of color before.
Right. Okay, well, thank you everybody for your questions. And once again, thank you for joining us at this author talk.
Thank you very much.
Right, I shall close the meeting then. Thank you. And I hope you enjoy the rest of the OLA Superconference. There is really a very impressive lineup of speakers and events. Right, thank you all, and goodbye for now.